Hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's salon, tonight's bibliotherapy session, which is all about young adult literature, which I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you. Before we start, I'd also love to tell you about some really exciting events coming up on the salon, which you must get your tickets for now because they are selling like hotcakes. And the first one is on Friday, the 14th of May. So that's only like 2 days' time. It's What It Feels Like for a Girl, a memoir by Paris Lees. And that's the subject of the interview, which is Paris Lees being interviewed by Alexandra Hemmensley, our own wonderful salonier. And this is going to be a wonderful evening. You can get your tickets on the Damien Barr Literary Salon website. It's only £5. The event takes place on YouTube, and you can then watch it as many times as you like and keep going back to it. So you've got it forever available. So that's going to be a wonderful event on Friday night. Then there's also on the 3rd of June an online celebration of Kate Moss's fantastic memoir, An Extra Pair of Hands. This is a heartwarming book that shines a light on the joys and challenges of being a carer. And it's both a love letter to carers over the centuries and the history of carers, but also uh, a memoir of Kate Moss's own life as a carer, helping her own mother care for her beloved father through Parkinson's, and then supporting her mother in widowhood, and finally looking after her 90-year-old mother-in-law. So that's going to be a fantastic evening on the 3rd of June when Kate Moss is going to be interviewed by Sam Baker. So do join us then. That is going to be an excellent evening too. And you can also get your tickets for that on the Damien Barr Literary Salon website. And again, it's only a fiver. So there's lots of brilliant events coming up. Do have a look on that website for where you can get your tickets. I'm having a bit of a party vibe tonight, as you'll see in my room here with lights on the ceiling. I do love those lights very passionately. The party vibe is because it's all about young adults, and I'm going to be talking about young adult literature this evening. So I'd love to know if you are readers of young adult literature. Do you know what it is? And if you do, what are the young adult books that you love to read the most? So, first of all, we're going to start with a definition of young adult literature. And I have this rather handy book called 30-Second Literature, which is full of helpful definitions of everything in literature, from the novel to the haiku to literary devices such as satire. And it's also full of some really nice little biographies of some of the key literary people over history. But here we have a definition of young adult literature. I'm trying to get it in focus so you can actually see the type, but it's a very beautiful book, which I happen to have written quite a lot of and edited. But I do love it because it's not only informative, but it's also a thing of beauty. So here we have a definition of young adult literature. The literary term young adult was first created when S.E. Hinton wrote The Outsiders in 1967, a novel she began when she was 15 years old. When it was published 3 years later, it was clear that the novel's readers were mostly her own age. Publishers realised that this group, aged 12 to 18, had their own preoccupations, and authors began to write for them, sometimes with problem novels depicting extreme situations like drug addiction, as a way to hook their interest. They placed a protagonist in their teens at the centre of the story, using changes in circumstance and character to drive the plot. Authors like Judy Blume realised that a large audience of young people was keen to read about taboo subjects such as sex and menstruation, which she addressed unflinchingly in titles like Forever and Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, which were published in 1975 and 1970. So it's been going for a long time, this YA literature lark. Among other topics, the genre explores our sexuality, first love, friendship, identity, mortality, eating disorders, and suicide. The demographic has also expanded, with adults increasingly keen readers of YA fiction, in the case of cult hits such as the Harry Potter, Twilight, and Hunger Games series, while in recent decades, YA fiction has become popular in Africa, India, and China. So thanks for joining me, everyone, on Instagram and Facebook. It's lovely to have you with me here tonight. I'd love to know if any of you are readers of young adult fiction, and if so, which are your favourite YA novels? I know a huge number of people have read the Harry Potter novels. Do put your hand up if you're one of them. There's also the Philip Pullman Northern Lights trilogy, which are an epic and famous young adult collection. But what else have you read beyond those? I would love to know. I'd also just like to point out that the YA novel is not to be confused with the coming of age novel or Bildungsroman, which is about the transition between childhood and adulthood and is written primarily for adults. This stage of life, becoming an adult, is particularly agonizing, illuminating, and intense, and has thus inspired some of the most rewarding fiction of all time, from Le Grand Meurne, 1913, by Alain Fournier, to The Colour Purple, 1982, by Alice Walker. So that is also an interesting fact that the YA novel, sorry, just showing off this beautiful book once again before I put it down, is not to be confused with the coming of age novel. So, for instance, a book like Normal People by Sally Rooney is not a YA novel, it's a novel about young adults. So that is an important and subtle difference. And even The Catcher in the Rye, which many people see as a young adult novel, was actually written for adults, not for teenagers, which is intriguing in itself. The Clockwork Orange by Malcolm Bradbury is also one that Burgess, is also a book which could be seen as a young adult novel, but I would contest was actually written for adults. So there is a bit of a definition of young adult fiction for you. When I was in my teens, I was not consciously reading young adult novels. And I think many people back then weren't doing that either. It wasn't really such a big thing. There was there were books like the ones by Judy Blume, but they actually hadn't really crossed the seas to England in a big way, in my experience. So I was reading books more like Jilly Cooper, James Herbert, and Daphne du Maurier. She was my young adult fiction. What were you reading, I wonder, when you were teenagers? I'd love to know. There's now an amazing number of fabulous YA novels for teenagers. Some people would suggest that writing young adult novels for teenagers might be a dumbing down of those teenagers. But I would disagree, because a huge number of the young adult novels that teenagers are reading are absolutely brilliant, beautifully written, incredibly thought provoking, and very mind expanding. So we're going to come on to some of those shortly. one of the early young adult fiction novels that has been mentioned by quite a few people when I sent out this idea on Twitter of what people read when they were teens is The Pigman by Paul Zindel, which is uh, a brilliant young adult novel written in 1969. Look at that cover for a classically hilarious and really probably rather off-putting cover to teenagers of today. This is a brilliant novel. It does now feel maybe a tiny bit dated in some ways, but it's very thought-provoking and has many issues which are still written about by the young adult authors of today. So the story is narrated in alternating chapters by two high school sophomores, Lorraine and John, who become friends because of their shared absurd sense of humour and boredom with school. And there's some absolutely brilliant passages about John setting off bombs in the loos in his school, which he constantly does and is always getting into trouble. And obviously they just hate school. They're constantly creating pranks, and one of their pranks is to call people up on the phone, which is what we used to do in the 1980s as well, 70s rather, when I was a teenager, I must admit. And the two kids, teenagers, ring Mr. Pignati, and they end up going to his house on the pretense that they're collecting money for the L&J fund, which is of course them. Mr. Pignati's really invites them in and gives them a check, which they then feel quite guilty about because they realize that he seems actually to be very lonely. And he invites the two friends to go to the zoo the next day, which they then do, and they become friends, and it's all very touching and lovely. They call him the Pig Man because he's called Mr. Pignati, and he also has a collection of pigs which was given to him by his dead wife. And without giving spoilers, bad things happen to those China pigs in the towards the end of the book. It's a really touching, surprising, and odd young adult novel, which I think now just feels dated because of the way it's written, but it's still absolutely brilliant and has many of the same preoccupations that young adult novels have today. So that's an early example. There are many different types of young adult novels, as I was describing to you earlier. And one of the major trends in YA novels is dystopian fiction. So there are novels like The Hunger Games, the Divergent series, the series which are called Uglies, Pretties, and Perfect, I think they're called, which are, I'm just looking if I can find them because I do have many of these books to hand and they're really good, but not high literature, I must admit. However, some of these dystopian novels are really thought-provoking and great for the adult reader too. And one of my favourites is Feed by M.T. Anderson, which is a book all about the internet being plugged into your very brain. And M.T. Anderson wrote this probably about 10 years ago now, and it is horribly prophetic. It's a book describing the hero, Titus, who goes to the moon on an ordinary trip, a chance to party during their spring break and play with some stupid low grav at the Ricochet Lounge. But then while they're there on the moon playing with their low gravity, their brains get hacked, and we realize that they and their society rely on having a constant feed of updates on the internet going directly into their brain. There's no escape from the internet. Imagine if the internet went straight in and you had no escape from it. They are able to chat to people constantly, and they also have adverts constantly going directly into their brains. And I love the way in this book the voice of the protagonist, Titus, changes from being in love with his feed to slowly questioning it and beginning to wonder if it actually is a good thing, and finally rebelling against the constant feed. I'm going to read you a bit from this book, which is definitely one which I would highly recommend to adults to read because it's very thought-provoking. It is dystopian and great. This chapter is called Missing the Feed. I missed the feed. I didn't know when they first had feeds, like maybe 50 or 100 years ago. Before that, they had to use their hands and their eyes. Computers were all outside the body. They carried them around outside of them, in their hands, like if you carried your lungs in a briefcase and opened it to breathe. People were really excited when they first came out with feeds. It was all da-da-da, this big educational thing, da-da-da, your child will have the advantage, encyclopedias at their fingertips, closer than their fingertips, etc. That's one of the great things about the feed, that you can be super smart without ever working. Everyone is super smart now. You can look things up, automatic, like science and history, like if you want to know which battles of the Civil War George Washington fought in and shed. It's more now, it's not so much about the educational stuff, but more regarding the fact that everything that goes on the feed. All of the feedcasts and the instant news, that's on there. So there's all the entertainment I was missing without a feed. So he's had his feed cut off and he can barely cope. I was missing, like the girls were all missing their favourite feedcast, this show called Oh, Wow, Thing, which has all these kids like us who do stuff but get all pouty, which is what the girls go crazy for, the poutiness. Sound familiar? Anyone with a teenager? But the braggest thing about the feed, the thing that made it really big, is that it knows everything you want and hope for, sometimes before you even know what those things are. It can tell you how to get them and help you make buying decisions that are hard. Everything we think and feel is taken by the corporations, mainly by data ones like Feedlink and OnFeed and American Feedware, and they make a special profile, one that's keyed just to you. And then they gave it to their branch companies, or other companies buy them, and they can get to know what it is we need. So all you have to do is want something, and there's a chance it will be yours. Of course, everyone is like, da da da, evil corporations, oh, they're so bad. We all say that. And we all know they control everything. I mean, it's not great because who knows what evil shit they're up to. Everyone feels bad about that. But they're the only way to get all this stuff. And it's no good getting pissy about it because they're still going to control everything, whether you like it or not. Plus, they keep everyone in the world employed, so it's not like we could do without them. And it's really great to know everything about everything whenever we want, to have it just like that, in our brain, just sitting there. In fact, the thing that made me pissy was when they couldn't help me at all. So I was just lying there and couldn't play any of the games on the feed and couldn't chat anyone. And I couldn't do a fucking thing except look at that stupid boat painting, which was even worse because now I saw that there was no one on the boat, which was even more stupid and was kind of how I felt, that the sails were up and the rudder was, well, whatever rudders are, but there was no one on board to look at the horizon. That is Feed by M.T. Anderson, a great dystopian novel, which all sounds a little bit too close to the bone. Another fabulous dystopian novel, which I greatly love, is the Patrick Ness trilogy, which is called the Chaos Trilogy, The Knife of Never Letting Go, The Ask and the Answer, and Chaos Walking. They are excellent dystopian novels which are incredibly memorable for many reasons, and I feel one of the reasons is that they are simply set in such a different and memorable world where everyone can hear each other's thoughts. So it's the other side of the coin to Feed, because Feed is all about the internet being plugged into your brain. In this dystopian trilogy, the Patrick Ness trilogy, everyone's gone to another planet. That's where humanity has gone to try and survive an apocalypse. And when they arrive at that planet, it seems that everyone can understand and hear each other's thoughts. I'm going to read you a little bit from my book, The Story Cure, that I wrote with the wonderful Susan Elderkin, which is a book where you can look up any ailment relating to children and young adults and find a cure in the form of either a novel or a picture book, depending on the age of your child. And I'm going to give you our cure for wanting to be left alone, the cure for young adults. And that cure is The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. For older children, wanting to be left alone takes on new hormonal angles which are hard for the grown-up to interpret and even harder for the adolescent to explain. See Adolescence, Hormones Raging. The bedroom door stays shut for hours on end, and excuses are given for not joining in with family activities. Todd, the hero of The Knife of Never Letting Go, the first in Patrick Ness's excellent Chaos Walking trilogy, feels the need to escape the company of others more than most, living as he does on a planet where everyone can literally hear one another's thoughts. Surrounded day and night by all the noise that men spill out of themselves, all their clamour and clatter, which comes at you and at you and at you, it's not surprising that Todd has started taking long walks on the lonely marshes with his dog, Manchi, to try and find some peace. Even here, he still has Manchi's thoughts to contend with, though they're somewhat basic in content and expression. Need a poo, Todd? Hungry, Todd? While he's trying to limit his exposure to noise and avoid whatever it is the older men have in store for him, a vague menace lurking around his imminent transition to manhood, he stumbles across something unexpected. No women have existed on this planet since a virus wiped them out, and yet, here on the marshes, Todd finds cause to question this assumption. Teenagers will relate to Todd's need for privacy and also to the joy of one day finding someone with whom to share their innermost thoughts. So you can find many more recommendations for young adult novels in this wonderfully helpful tome, The Story Cure, which also has recommendations for younger children of all ages. Another dystopian story, which I have recently loved and discovered, is by Adam Silvera, and it's called They Both Die at the End. It's kind of a dystopian love story in a way, because it's a world where our technology has managed to predict the day of your death. So they have a corporation called Deathcast, which phones you up on the day that you're going to die at 1 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts and tells you this is your death day. And you then get to spend the day in the way that you like, knowing that this is your final day on Earth. It is a really very sad book because it is all about death, as so many young adult books are. But it's also a love story, and it is a beautiful one. It's about Matteo and Rufus, who are initially total strangers, and they have both been told on this day, this is the day of their death. They were phoned up by Deathcast. And luckily, there's an app for just this occasion where you can find a last friend. And they both happen to go on this app, find each other, and spend this day together. I won't tell you what happens. It is a really fantastic story. It is very, very romantic, but it's a great one for making you think about mortality and what you would do if you literally did have only one day left to live. It's not for the faint-hearted in a way, but it is also a celebratory novel, even though it is sad. I'm going to come more onto that subject of books all about death in the young adult world. But first, I just want to mention another topic within the young adult world, which is identity crisis and culture, which is, of course, a huge and important topic within young adult literature. And one of the first of these novels that was written is the absolutely true story of a part-time Indian by Sherman Alexie, which is a really great, very interesting, very revealing book. Also written as a kind of graphic novel. Well, it's not really a graphic novel, but it does have quite a lot of pictures in it because the hero actually wants to be a cartoonist. It's a novel told from the perspective of a Native American teenager, Arnold Spirit Jr., also known as Junior, who is 14 and a very promising cartoonist. It's all about his life on an Indian reservation and his decision to go to an all-white public high school off the reservation. So it's very much about racism and about forming your identity. Also, he has some kind of learning issues which are really interesting and at times quite extreme. It's about his culture and the culture clash with the white people surrounding him. And that is a great coming of age identity young adult novel. Speaking of issues, another one of my favorite young adult novels, which I have read over the last few years, is The Knife That Killed Me by Anthony McGowan, which is quite a hard-hitting, to say the least, novel about knife culture in schools. And it has one of the best starts to a novel ever. So I'm just going to read you that. But it is a book that I'd really recommend to teenagers and also to adults. It's one of those books that adults should read just as much as teenagers. Anthony McGowan writes brilliantly. He won the Carnegie Medal last year for his book Lark, which I've got somewhere to hand, which I'm going to brandish when I see it. Oh, here it is. Which is also an absolutely fantastic book. And he's written several other brilliant young adult novels. But I'm just going to read you a bit of The Knife That Killed Me. The knife that killed me was a special knife. Its blade was inscribed with magical runes from a lost language, and the metal glimmered with 1,000 colours, iridescent as a peacock's tail or the slick of petrol on a puddle. It was made from a meteorite that had plunged to Earth after a journey of 100 million miles. The heat of entry burned off its crust of brittle rock, leaving a core of iron infused with traces of iridium, titanium, platinum, and gold. It was first forged into a blade in ancient Persia, where, set in a hilt of ivory and rhino horn, it pressed from hand to hand, worshipped and feared for its power. From Persia, it was looted by Alexander the Great, who plucked it from the fingers of King Darius as he lay dying. With Alexander, it went to India, where it severed the tendons of the war elephants of Porus, leaving the beasts to vent their fury on the dry earth with thrashing tusks. With Alexander's death, the blade was lost to history for 300 years before it emerged again, taken by Julius Caesar from the royal treasury of Cleopatra. For 2 centuries, it was worn by Roman emperors, and this was the knife that the mad Caligula used to cut the child from his sister's womb. The blade went east again with Valerian to subdue the barbarians. 5 legions perished in the desert, pierced by Parthian arrows, and the emperor's last sight on this earth was his own knife as it cut out his eyes. And for how long did he feel the cool intensity of its edge as he was flayed and his skin made into a fleshy bag for horse shit, a gory trophy for the victor's temple? From Parthians it passed to Arabs driven in their conquest by the fervour of faith. And then at Parley the brave but covetous eye of Richard Coeur de Lion saw the glimmer in Saladin's belt, and that noble Saracen gave up the knife for the sake of peace. With Richard it arrived at last in England. Again a thing of secret worship, dark rites, unholy acts. It moved like an illness of the blood from generation to generation, exquisite but cursed. Until finally, after its journey of eons, it came to me and found its home in my heart. Yes, a special knife, a cruel knife, a subtle knife. I wish. Well, I've had a long time to think about it. So now, the truth. The knife that killed me wasn't a special knife at all. It didn't have any runes on it. Its handle wasn't made of ivory and rhino horn, but cheap black plastic. It was a kitchen knife from Woolworths, and its blade wobbled like a loose tooth. But it did the job. That is a fantastic read. It kept me completely up till the early hours when I read it. I would thoroughly recommend it to young adults and adults alike. And Anthony McGowan has written many excellent other novels, such as Hello Darkness, which is a kind of detective story with deep and dark mental health issues. He's also written Lark and 3 other novels who have the same characters running through them. So there's a collection of 4 novels which all link up, and they're all really lovely reads, beautifully produced, great gifts, and really wonderful for both adults and teenagers to read. Anthony McGowan, I think, very much follows in the tradition of Barry Hines, who wrote the wonderful novel A Kestrel for a Knave, which is also actually not a young adult novel, though it is one that is read by many teenagers. Really, it's one of those novels that I believe was written for adults, but being about teenage issues, it's become a kind of YA classic. Anyway, I'm diverting. Anthony McGowan has said in interviews that he was very much inspired by Barry Hines when he was a child himself, because Barry Hines used the dialect of the place where he grew up, and Anthony McGowan does that too. Dominic, thanks for the comment on the lights. I would just reveal those to the Facebook watchers who don't get such a joyous view of those lights. I'm having the lights in order to create a party vibe, because we're talking about young adult literature, and quite a lot of YA literature involves parties. So I've been talking about different issues in YA literature, and of course finding your identity is one of those issues that is frequently explored. Also gender fluidity and sexuality are very much explored in YA. And I would love to just mention Every Day by David Levithan, which is a great book exploring many of these issues, in which the hero spends every day in a different body. He has a bizarre condition that means he wakes up each day in a new person's body, and he has no control over whose body that will be. The only thing that he knows is that he will be a day older every day when he wakes up. And it's a great premise for a novel, because the consciousness of our hero, who calls himself A, because there's not really much point in having a name, moves from body to body, and he goes into girls, he goes into boys, he goes into very skinny people, very large people, he goes into someone who's disabled, he goes into someone who's blind. So he has all kinds of different experiences in these different bodies. He does also fall in love with a girl, and the story is about his love affair with that girl and how he can possibly pursue that relationship when he's waking up every day in a different body. So that is a fantastic and very romantic and lovely book, which has also been made into a film. Another one which I'd love to mention, which also talks about identity and sexuality, is The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness. So we've had a bit of Patrick Ness already talking about the Chaos Walking trilogy, but this one, The Rest of Us Just Live Here, is a great story about being a normal person, being an ordinary person, and that being a good thing, not having to be the one that saves the world. Not everyone has to be the chosen one. Not everyone has to be the guy that saves the world. Most people just have to live their lives the best they can, doing things that are great for them, having great friends, trying to make their lives better, loving people properly, all the while knowing that the world makes no sense, but trying to find a way to be happy anyway. So that's Patrick Ness in The Rest of Us Just Live Here, which is a really great and lovely novel. And that's actually some of the issues that also come up in They Both Die at the End, which I was talking about earlier. As I was mentioning earlier, some of the issues tackled in young adult novels can be tackled in a more full-on and head-on way than they might be in adult literature. And one of the books that has had a huge impact in the last few years is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas, which is a story all about racial issues and race inequality in America. It tells the story of Star Carter, a Black American teenager who leads something of a double life because she lives with her parents in a poor Black neighborhood in Garden Heights where gang membership, drug dealings, and shootings are rife. But every day, 16-year-old Star makes the journey to a private school in a predominantly white, affluent suburb where she has almost no Black friends. She is very good at fitting in, but she feels like she has to be, in a way, a completely different person in each context. And the fact that she's constantly modifying her behavior to fit in seems to her to be ridiculous and terrible. She even speaks differently when she's at school to when she does back at home. One evening, Star gets a lift home from the Garden Heights party with a childhood friend, Khalil, and when their car is pulled over by a white police officer, he is shot dead, and Star is the only witness. So that's the beginning of the story, and it's incredibly dramatic. It's a great and insightful novel about the injustices perpetrated in the US, and it makes you think very much about racial issues, Black Lives Matter in the world generally. And there are many more brilliant novels, but that was one of the ones that is very hard hitting and very powerful, recently published. I will be putting a list of all these books on the website, and I'm worried that I've got to race through lots of other books, so I'm going to continue. Literature about dying teenagers is quite a huge area of YA lit. So we've got The Fault in Our Stars, which I'm sure everyone will have heard of, either seen the film or read the book. It is a brilliant, very moving and tragic book about two teenagers who are both dying of cancer. Then there's also Ways to Live Forever, which is another incredibly sad, deeply moving book by Sally Nichols about a boy called Sam who is dying. And he's made a list of all the things that he wants to do before he dies. He's got leukemia. And it's a really lovely, unsentimental, beautifully written book. Sally Nichols is a fantastic writer, and I would actually recommend this to everyone again because it's highly brilliantly written and thought-provoking. Then there's also Before I Die, which is another very sad book about, I think she has leukemia as well. Tessa, she's 16, she's going to die, and she's made a list of 10 things that she wants to do in the time she has left, including having sex, taking drugs, stealing, various other things. And this is actually a very life-affirming book as well. Um, Surprisingly enough, many of these books, which are deeply sad in their premise, are oddly life-affirming. Then there's another one in the same vein called My Sister Lives on the Mantelpiece by Annabelle Pitcher, which is a great book written in the voice of a 10-year-old boy whose sister died in a terrorist attack. And again, it's incredibly sad, but it's all about his life after having lost his sister. And this is one that everyone should read too. It's a gorgeous story. It's set in the north of England. It is sad, but it's also one that urges you to take courage and live your life to the full in the light of someone that you love having died. Another issue that comes into young adult literature frequently is pregnancy. But actually, before I mention that, I noticed this was on my table. A Monster Calls, another one by Patrick Ness, another one talking about death, which is also another gorgeous book. Definitely just as much for adults as it is for teenagers, if not more so, with incredibly beautiful illustrations. And this is a book that does hit you really hard if you've ever lost anyone or if you've known anyone that has cancer, because this is about our hero's mother dying of cancer, and a monster comes to talk to him while his mother is dying. This monster, in a way, seems to offer healing powers because he's a kind of yew tree monster, but he's also offering stories to the boy. And the boy doesn't really want the stories, he wants his mother to live. But this is a really profoundly moving and wonderful book. Pregnancy in teenage literature is another great topic, which is frequently touched upon. And one of my favourite books in that vein is Boys Don't Cry by Mallory Blackman. Here we have it. Which is such a great book. It has a brilliant beginning as well, where the hero of the book, called Dante, is just about to get his A-level results. He's all set for a brilliant academic career. He's an A-grade student when a girl turns up at his door with a baby. She leaves the baby on his doorstep, essentially, and it becomes apparent that he is the dad, much to his horror and shock. And he then becomes a teenage father. And this is a really deeply moving and wonderful story about being a father. It's very beautiful about being a father, but also being a teenage father and how difficult that is. And it's brilliantly written. Another one that's great on the same vein is Trouble by Non Pratt, which is about a 15-year-old girl who becomes a mother. You can see from the cover what's going on. Non Pratt is another great young adult writer, and I thoroughly recommend this book to readers both younger and past their 20s. So I'm just racing through the pregnancy style YA novels. Another unusual issue in young adult novels, in fact, I only know of one book of this type, is the fantastic and brilliant book One by Sarah Crossan, which is about conjoined twins. And it's beautifully written in poem form. So here you can see that this would not be by any means a long read because it's all written in poetry, which if you listen to it as an audiobook, you wouldn't notice. It actually sounds like just a beautifully written novel. It tells the story of Grace and Tippy, who are literally joined at the hip. And they have all the teenage issues that any teenager would have: falling in love, wondering what they're going to do for their future, wondering about their sexuality, questioning their very identity, but at the same time being joined literally at the hip. And it's a really thought-provoking, lovely book about being siblings, really. I'll just read you a tiny bit of it to give you a little glimpse of the way it's written. And this is why we never went to school. Hang on, did I start at the end? I think I started at the end. Here we go. Summer's breath begins to cool. The ink of night comes earlier and earlier. And out of the blue, Mum announces that Tippy and I will no longer be taught at home. In September, you'll join a class of juniors and go to school like everyone else, she says. I don't make any ripples. I listen and nod and pull at a loose thread in my shirt until a button falls away. But Tippy doesn't stay silent. She detonates. Are you kidding me? Have you lost your minds? She shouts, then argues with Mum and Dad for hours. I listen and nod and bite at the skin around my fingernails until they start to bleed. Finally, Mum rubs her temples, sighs, and gives it to us straight. Donations from well-wishers have dried up, and we simply can't afford to homeschool you. You know your dad hasn't found a job yet, and Grammy's pension doesn't even cover the cable bill. You girls aren't cheap, Dad adds, as though all the money spent on us, the hospital bills and special clothes, could be saved if we'd both only behave a little better. You see, Tippy and I are not what you'd call normal. Not what you see every day, or any day for that matter. Anyone with a jot of good manners calls us conjoined. Though we've been dubbed other things too: freaks, fiends, monsters, mutants, and even a two-headed demon once, which made me cry so hard I had puffy eyes for a week. But there's no denying our difference. We are literally joined at the hip, united in blood and bone. And this is why we never went to school. This is a really great, amazing book. It makes you wonder what it would be like to be literally joined at the hip, but it also makes you question your own feelings about your own siblings, if you have any, and it makes you wonder what sacrifices you would make if you had to for them. So very much recommend that book too. I think I accidentally missed this one out earlier, How I Live Now by Meg Rossoff, which is also in the dystopian apocalyptic genre, one of my favourite YA novels. Both me and my husband cried for hours when we read this, probably about 15 years ago. It's a bit of a classic of the YA genre, I would say. But Meg Rossoff is an amazing writer who also recently published this new book, The Great Godden, which is a love story in the vein of, it makes me think about books like We Were Liars, which is another wonderful YA novel, which I've mentioned before on another session that I've done about great fires in literature. But this is a book where teenagers are hanging out by the sea, falling in love, strange and dramatic events occur. Meg Rossoff's The Great Godden is in that similar vein, but it's set in the UK, again by the sea, in a wonderfully eccentric house where people sleep in turrets and have wonderful evenings with enormous glass walls looking out to the sea. And Meg Rossoff, I think, is really great at creating eccentric characters. In this book, the very beginning of the book, the heroine, Daisy, gets off the plane from America and she's met by her cousin, Charlie, age 14, who's smoking a fag, and he then drives her in a Jeep all the way from Heathrow to their house a couple of hours away, age 14, and she immediately falls in love with him. It's such a good book. I would deeply recommend anything by Meg Rosoff to all ages of readers. Another brilliant young adult novel that I must bring to your attention if you don't know it already, thinking of the issues of identity and becoming, is Becoming Dinah by the amazingly wonderful writer Kit Duvall, which is a powerful exploration of obsession and identity and discovering your own identity. In a way, this is a retelling of the story of Moby Dick, but through the lens of a coming of age story with teen girls. And it's very funny, the references to Moby Dick, which add an extra level to the story. But it's mostly the story of a metamorphosis of a teenager from someone who doesn't really know herself to someone who is ready to go ahead into the world. So it starts off with the young protagonist, Dinah, shaving off her amazing hair. She has absolutely incredible, huge dreadlocks, and she shaves off all her hair right at the beginning of the book. And it's about how and why she has to run away from her cult that she's been living in, and to make a series of small multiple choices and changes that lead up to an enormous change in her life. It's very much a story about identity, becoming, as is revealed in the title, disillusionment, growing up, not just finding, but actively creating your own path. And I think this is one of the things that we love so much about young adult literature, is that it's all about creating your own path and embracing your future. And I think the reason that adults like to read it so much too is because often in these YA novels, the protagonists have an amazing energy and an amazing ability and desire to recreate themselves and jump onto a new boat to take them on a new direction into a different stage of life. And I really think that is one of the reasons that we love reading young adult books so much. I've just got a few more to mention though. Thinking of hormones in young adult literature, Melvin Burgess is great on having ridiculously outrageous flowing hormones in every direction, with his books Doing It, which is all about boys being desperate to have sex with girls, essentially. It's very funny. And the characters are really lovable, even if they are constantly thinking only about their erections. Then there's also Lady, My Life as a Bitch by Melvin Burgess, which is about a girl in the same situation who actually gets turned into a dog and a bitch. And she is pretty much having sex with any other dog she can find. And it again is incredibly funny and kind of shocking, outrageous. Damien, thanks for your backup. That story is such a good one, and I absolutely love it. Both Doing It and Lady, My Life as a Bitch, are the two sides of the coin in the way the girls have the raging hormones and the boys have the raging hormones. They're both very funny, and they also have lots of other great things going on them with them in terms of social commentary. Because Melvin Burgess is also great on drugs with his book Junk. So drugs is another whole section of YA lit that I haven't really had a chance to touch upon, but Melvin Burgess does it really well with his book Junk, which is all about teenagers getting slowly sucked into a world where heroin takes over their lives, and it's really depressing but also ultimately does have hope at the end. Another one that's great is Juno Dawson's Clean, which is about a girl who goes to rehab in order to kick her drug habit. And she thinks that that's going to be the end of it and it will be time for her to start a new life. But in some ways, this is just the beginning of other traumas. But that's a really great and brilliant novel about drugs. Digressing there, because I wanted to also mention Blood Moon by Lucy Cuthew. So that relates to the hormone side of life. It's about a girl who is period shamed. This has only just come out. It's a book that was one of the shortlist for the young adult fiction prize. In fact, I'm not sure which one was the winner. Maybe it was. I'll have to put that on the notes afterwards. And it's written in verse. It's Cuthew's debut novel, and it's all about being period shamed publicly and online in a really hideous way. So, in brief, the girl has a kind of sexual encounter with a boy who then realizes that she's got her period. Is he the guy that then publicly shames her and puts it all over the internet? That is discovered as the book goes on. It's an amazing book written in verse, and the great and joyous thing about it is that the girls take action and go off into taking it into their own hands, so to speak, and they get their own back basically on the people that were shaming them with the hashtag no shame. And it's a really much needed, just published novel. Another one which is great is Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian, which is a really fabulous novel written actually about 10 years ago, and it has an Iranian element. The writer is of Iranian origins, living in New York. And I just want to share with you this lovely review of the book written by a reviewer called Chai, which I think encapsulates many of the things we love about young adult novels. Like a Love Story is the kind of book I wish I read as a teen, when I was still navigating the pathways of my sexuality and needed the kindness of a friend who sits with you in comfort by the fire and can't change what's wrong, but reminds you that you're not on your own. When I finished the book, I felt somehow at once endlessly heavy and weightless. My chest still trills with something I cannot quite name: recognition and sorrow and hope all at once. The whole world still feels shaped around this story, a warm, welcoming place, ready to receive me. Whenever I long to open the book and run my fingers under the words, feeling for the hope I will always find sheltered there. Isn't that a fantastic review? It's a book that reviewer, Chai, loved so much that she wants to go back and caress the book, and she will still get those gorgeous, warm feelings from the book whenever she returns to it. So many other books I wanted to mention. A brief rundown: I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson, one of my absolute favourites, all about twins who are artists in their teens who have a terrible crisis when they lose their mother. And the boy is gay, but he doesn't want to admit it. He falls in love. It's all incredibly tortured, but absolutely wonderful and very much life embracing. And as a painter myself, it's a book that really makes you want to splash colour in every direction and create amazing and brilliant art. There's also a really wonderful sculptor in the book who makes you want to create sculptures. And this is also what we love about these YA novels. They're all about creativity too. Then there's Bethany Rutter's Melt My Heart, just shortlisted for the Young Adult Book Prize too, which is a gorgeous, inclusive, sunny romance centering around a fat protagonist, also addressing queer identity, another one with twins. And then there's also Love is for Losers by Wibke Brueggemann, which is a laugh out loud look at first love, loss, and trying to avoid the girl of your dreams. Then yet one more before I stop is Loveless by Alice Oseman, which is about a girl who is possibly realizing that she may be aromantic. She is kind of desperate to fall in love. She's desperate to have a romance, but she realizes when she goes to university and starts trying desperately to date people and find someone to fall in love with that she may indeed be aromantic, which is again another really interesting issue, which is great that it's being written about now. So next week on my Instagram Live, I'm going to be talking to Claire Fuller with her amazing novel Unsettled Ground. So do join me for that on my Ella Bertu Instagram, which will be very exciting. Then next month, here on the Damien Barr Literary Salon, I'm going to be talking about short stories on the 6th of June. On the 14th of July, I'll be talking about happiness in literature. And also, don't forget to go to the Salon website to book those tickets for the wonderful Paris Lees interview with Alexandra Hemmensley on the 14th of May. That's this Friday. And the Kate Moss interview with Sam Baker on the 3rd of June. So many wonderful things to look out for and be excited about. Go and get those tickets. They're only a £5. And you will then have that ticket forever and you can watch it as many times as you like. I will see you here in a month's time and see you next week on my Instagram page for Claire Fuller. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. I'll put a post up with all those young adult titles on my Instagram, and you can also go to the Books.org website to find a list of, Bookshop.org, to find a list of all the books that I've been talking about this evening. So you could buy the whole lot if you are so inclined. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. Have a great night and see you soon.